evening, wherever you're coming in from. Welcome to our corporate engagement program's first ever peer-to-peer learning session. We're really excited today to be sharing case studies from members of the corporate engagement program on step 1. And we're going to be hearing from Soné Inel, BL Evolution, WWF France, and Metabolic. And I want to say a special thanks to all of the presenters for being brave enough to present the case studies. Really, the purpose of today is to learn from each other and also to share some insights with our technical team who are online also. Sarah, next slide. Just a few housekeeping rules. Please rename yourself so that we know who we're going to call on later on. So put your name and your organization in the participant list. And this session is going to be recorded because we want to share it with some of the members of the corporate engagement program who unfortunately could not be with us today. So it's only so that they can hear, and also folks from our technical team who could not make it today. And if you do want to ask a question after each of the presenters, we ask that you raise your hand and one of us will call on you, and then take yourself off of mute and ask your question. So the order of operations is that we'll have a presentation and then we'll have a few minutes for you to ask any questions you have of the team. The purpose of today's session, again, is really to learn from each other on how we're addressing step 1, which I know is a very challenging step to do, and you guys are great for getting going on this. So thank you for starting and for being brave. And we're very excited to learn from you. And we also invited our technical team to come in and hear your case studies so that they can also learn from you. So again, here's the agenda. There will be time for a Q&A. And I think with that, we are ready to get started. So, oh yes, we have a few questions. Sarah, what was the first question we were going to ask?
The first question is on what superpower they would have. Just a little icebreaker.
If you could have any superpower in the world, what superpower would you choose? And you can put it in the, fly. Here are your choices: flying, time travel, invisibility, reading minds. I don't think I'd want to read anyone's mind. I'd be afraid. All right, it looks like the overwhelming majority wish they could time travel. I'm wondering if that's to the past or to the future. I'd be curious. Let's talk about that offline. Rachel put flying. All right. Well, thanks for playing along, everyone. This is just to get us going. This is just a little icebreaker. Did we have another question, Sarah?
No,
yes.
Oh.
Time travel is one way to be ubiquitous. Very true. Sarah, what was the other question we were going to ask?
We were going to ask what the weather was like, where everyone's at.
Yeah, so that's just you just type in what the weather's like where you're at. And I'm going to say it's warm here in DC and very sunny. It's a beautiful spring day here. Can we show, Sarah? That's the old one. What's the weather like where you are today? Anyone? Anyone? Sunny, hot. Gloomy. I'm sorry, whoever's having gloomy weather. I'm sorry. All right, we've got a real mix of weather. This screen is making me a little dizzy, Sarah. We've got everything from beautiful to gloomy. So whoever's in the beautiful, sunny vibe right now, just send out your positive vibe to the folks that are disappointed and gloomy so we can have a nice meeting today. Thanks for playing along, everyone. I think we can get started now with the presentations. So we are going to start with Joanna Capella from SONAE, and she is going to be presenting her case study on step one. So Sarah, if you could pull up Joanna's presentation.
Can I start?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello, everybody. So first of all, let me thank you for this opportunity to share with you our first steps within the SBTN process. I would like to apologize. My voice is not in its best shape. The weather here is a little bit gloomy as well, aligned with my voice. So I hope that doesn't cause any problems in terms of understanding what I'm saying in the presentation. We hope you can learn and find helpful these first steps and trials that we have been doing since approximately January, aligned with the SBTN process. So next slide, please. So just to introduce a bit the company, SONAE has been founded in 1959 in Portugal, and it entails a very diverse portfolio of companies and businesses. For instance, it includes the retail sector, both the food, electronics, fashion, and others, but also a variety of businesses within SONAE Capital, including energy sector, cogeneration, solar, and wind, also industrial engineering, tourism with resorts and hotels, and also a fitness business. And within SONAE Industria and SONAE Arauco, we have been focusing on producing and management of renewable forestry resources and production of wood panels. So as you can see, it's quite diverse and it's quite challenging to work together. And we are working together as a whole company, as a whole corporate businesses to work for nature. So next slide, please. So how have we organized this will and this sustainability, which is within our DNA? We've looked at an approach at corporate level. So we set up like a consultancy group and focusing on 5 different areas of action, namely CO2 and climate change, plastic, also 2 other groups within a more social element, and obviously the nature and biodiversity, which we deemed very keen, a very priority group to work and area of action. And within this, the way we have tackled the initiative and the action plan was we aim to have this science-based target for nature by 2022. So this is aligned with the corporate program. And for this, to help us doing this, what we have set out is a partnership within a research center in Bio. It's based in Portugal, but it has a global spread. So it has several partners in terms of laboratories, and it has several areas of research. But within this partnership, the main thing is that it has a 2-year view, so aligned with SBTN, and it has a leadership of a researcher whose research fields is mainly focused on biodiversity in agricultural systems, but also has a PMO, a biologist, which is me, fully dedicated to develop this line of work, this line of action. And obviously within this partnership, we also have access to a number of researchers and PhDs and master degrees that are working actively for conservation in a number of areas, since genetic to global biodiversity. So this is the set in which we're working on for nature and biodiversity. Next slide, please. So within the SBTN process, we have started to look at the initial guidance. We have digested it and we have done some feedback, which I found it was positive for the SBTN team. And we have done, this was quite an intensive review of all the technical annexes, but also the guidance document. And we have adapted this and we've tried the tools. It's been a learning process, a learning curve. And we have also been reviewing as things are developing along. So next slide, please. So in this first step 1 and 2, the way we see it, and as I said, we have tried the tools, we have tried the core program, we have tested the sector level matrix, we have analyzed what type of data we have available, and we see it as a moment to understand what is happening, where it's happening, and how much, what impact is having on nature. So next slide, please. So obviously within this framework at the corporate level, which is how we are addressing this nature and biodiversity goal, we are looking at 4 key business sectors. The retail within his vast scope of food, fashion, textile, electronics, and also the wood panel industry, which has the manufacturing side of it as well, and the energy sector, which is, for instance, includes all the land use base, for instance, the solar panels, and also the tourism. So we're considering two-way approach, which are kind of very different in terms of methodology that we're considering. One is the value chain, which is we're assessing the entire value chain since the production side of capture in terms of ocean to the end of life of the products, but also from a land use perspective and more like land use based businesses, such as, for instance, the solar panels I mentioned. It's a different approach. You have to understand what was there before, what is there now, and how can we achieve and try to be better in terms of biodiversity. So it's a different mindset in terms of approach. Next slide, please. So in terms of value chain approach, because the other one, we're still working out several methods. So I'm going to focus today in the value chain approach that we have done. We found an article published on Nature, and we started in fashion because it was kind of more or less understood what type of impact and where they lie. So we looked at this article and we identified that it is very similar to the type of outputs that we're aiming for in the first step in the assess. So you see, you can have the picture of the impacts throughout the value chain, and at the end, you can see how much of a pair of jeans or a t-shirt means in terms of impacts. And from a retail point of view, this is a very interesting information to have per product, what type of impacts we're looking at. So next slide, please. So what we have done, and this is how we actually put our hands on this difficulty and challenging process, was we set up an Excel spreadsheet with a column where you have all the value chain steps. And to simplify it, we considered just 4. One is the production stage. The second is the transformation stage. And this can have many players, but we'll consider it as transformation stage, sorry. And then you have the retail, and then you have the end of life and consumer phase. We consider these 4. And with this as a column, and then for the lines, we were trying to look at the different impacts, where they are, and we were characterizing this step by step on the value chain. We also look briefly, a first insight in terms of what potential actions, what potential constraints we were looking at, and what could be our goals for that stage, within our value chain and for specific products. And we also looked at targets and indicators that would be sensible. And in terms of data that we use, obviously, in terms of business, you have data where does your products come from, where are your suppliers, and what are the main suppliers and producers, but also quantities, how much you purchase, how much you sell, and what is in your products in terms of composition. This is the primary data that we have already, easy to access. And then to do this exercise, we looked elsewhere as well in terms of other data sets like statistical data in FAO, national databases, and also we've looked into life cycle assessments and other scientific papers. So this was a bit the framework that we work with to do this preliminary assessment. Next slide, please. So this, as it's important to here to focus that sometimes the retail is seen as we buy products and we sell products, but it's more complex than that. And I suppose this reality applies to many sectors and business sectors. So for instance, in retail, you can have the own brand reality in which you actually decide what type of product composition you want. So you have some direct interference in terms of the transformation and design of your product, but you also have other sets, like for instance, you have at a local level a more close relation with some suppliers and some producers. So there's different levels of potential interference no, but influence on the way how things are done. And also you have a close relation to the consumer side of things. To do this exercise, we chose some key products aligned with the business sectors. So we chose clothes in general, but focus especially on jeans and denim. And we also looked at olive oil, natural yogurt, and fresh bean for the aquaculture side of things, and canned sardines, because it's a very national product, very looked at. And so we wanted to look, and because it also entails the transformational side of things, so the industrial element. And for Sonae Arauco and Sonae Industry, we'd look at the wood panel production. So next slide, please. I'm just going to glaze through some examples ahead, not going to focus too much, but these slides will be presented in a different version to you all, will be available. So what we have considered, when we were doing this exercise, we looked at some trends and in terms of data, what the type of impacts were normally the same in some steps. So we started to group them in categories. We used these 6 categories. Obviously, this is not a set in stone and it's not closed, and we welcome your feedback on this. So we use the land use, direct exploitation for marine resources, carbon footprint, chemical footprint in terms of use and discharges as well for the production and transformation stage. Waste, and here the waste is waste of raw material, so not necessarily packaging, paper and plastic or glass, whatever. It's the raw material that is being produced and throughout the value chain is being wasted, and also the water footprint. What we have not included in this assessment was the animal welfare, because it's slightly different than the biodiversity. It's related, obviously, but we didn't want to include it at this point. And also the other waste, for instance, plastic, paper, scoped out for the moment. Long value chains, for instance, within the electronics retail sector, were also scoped out because they're so complex, and normally they're working on grabbing pieces from different suppliers, and it's very difficult to trace back to Orange, to the production stage, and also scoped out the dependencies. And we considered 3 categories of weighting, so low, moderate, and high. So glancing quickly through these products, can you pass to the next slide, please? So the clothes, as you see here, we consider the different steps. It's always these 4 steps. And here we have some influence as well in the design of the product. So that can be an area to action. Next slide, please. Here, the olive oil that we also consider in terms of production, and we weighted here the intensive production, extensive production, and throughout the different steps. Next slide, please. Natural yogurt. Here we consider the natural yogurt because it has also the transformational stage, but because of the animal production as well. So here in this assessment, we considered all the, we included the food to feed the cows in this assessment. So the footprint is higher at the production level. So next slide, please. The fresh bream. So here the transformation doesn't apply. So it goes directly from the aquaculture to the stores. Next slide, please. And the canned sardines here. And just the next slide. This is just for you to show. I can share this with you later on. So I just want to explain you the process. That's the main message. Next slide, please. And the wood panel. So this also consider the recycling facilities that we have that recycle the timber, all timber products, and are reincorporated in the value chain. So we consider the whole process here. Next slide, please. So what we have achieved thus far, we have managed to map the value chain for case study project. We understand through this exercise what type of impacts and where are they more relevant for this case study project product, sorry. And we have a gross estimate. Obviously, considering the primary data that we have and the secondary data, this is a very gross estimate of where the main impacts might be. But this is an exercise to understand it better. And we also know throughout the supplier's location where they might be present. And through this exercise, we managed to see the spheres of influence. So where can we act? Because we did that initial insight on the actions, potential constraints. For instance, the geography and the distance within the value chain can be particularly difficult constraints to consider and to weight when defining some specific actions. And overall, we see this as a circular process. So it wasn't set in stone, and it still isn't. We're learning, and we want to go back and review it and incorporate another elements as we go along. Also, we can highlight that the majority of the impacts are located upstream from the retail's operations, and we want to expand this to other products. Next slide, please. So the next steps, and again, I want to reinforce that this is a circular process. We want to measure exactly. So the primary data, and as I said before, this is a gross estimate. We want to have a detailed estimate. So the next stage will be to actually launch a massive data request to the suppliers. And this will be done separately, considering the spheres of influence. So where we can have a bigger influence, it makes more sense to have a more detailed data request, where in long value chains and distant geographies, it's possible that our capacity to influence it's not so direct. So we need to find other ways to engage with these producers and suppliers. So at this point, we'll have less demanding data requests in that situation. And we also want to expand. So we're going to try an approach of determining which products correspond to 2080. So which 20 products correspond to 80% of the value. And we're going to map those and pay particular attention to those products. And again, I haven't presented it, but I'm going we're still ongoing for the land-based assessment. Next slide, please. That's me. I'm sorry if I was too fast or if my voice is disappearing.
No, that was great, Joanna. Thank you so much. It was really good to start with such a complicated business that you guys have. I think that it was super helpful. We were a little bit behind time because I was too slow in the beginning. So we have time for one question, but you know, Joanna, so if you have other questions, Joanna, can they ask you directly?
Yeah, of course.
Okay,
yes.
later, offline. Okay, so
Do.
we have a question from Fanny. How will you identify the 20 products that covers 80% of impacts?
Well, it's quite complex. So you have the purchase of products. So we're going to use that inventory, and basically we're going to bit by bit per year. So we're considering the baseline year 2020. So we're going to map all the products purchased, where they come from, and it's complex. You have the products categories, departments, and even supplies for different products categories. Just for an example, you have a cow, you have the steak, you have different bits of the cow in different products. So it's quite complex, but it's already ongoing. So we hope to have that designed already to start up the data sets, to the data requests in this month. So
Great.
I can, yeah.
Thank you, Joanna. Joanna, so you have a million questions now in chat, but we don't have time to answer them. So what we're going to do is send you these questions afterwards.
Yep, that's fine.
And get answers and put them out on our technical FAQs for everybody. We'll just make a special space for that. Okay.
Okay.
Does that sound good? All right. Awesome. Thank you so much, Joanna. We need to move on now to Enel. So we have Luisa Lotrovato and Ileana Levanto, and they've graciously agreed to talk about what Enel's doing. So take it away, Enel.
Thank you, Jess. Can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. And can you see me also, maybe?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So good morning and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Luisa Lotrovato. I'm working in the environment department of Enel Group. Next slide, please. So just a brief presentation about who Enel is. The very first chart, yes, thank you. So Enel Group is a multinational company founded in Italy in 1962 that counts almost 70,000 employees and 60 million customers, with a presence in 32 countries around the world, with 88 gigawatt of total capacity installed, of which 49 gigawatt from renewable sources, and 2.2 million kilometers of power lines in our distribution network. The strong commitment to an integrated and sustainable energy transition is directed towards achieving an integrated business model based, as you can see, on renewable growth and distribution and advanced electric energy services, leveraging the primary role of digitalization and platformization. So the next slide, please. Let's see the Enel evolution in the coming decades that is guided, as you may see, by the key energy transition-related trends of decarbonization of the energy mix, with very huge investments in renewable growth and electrification of energy consumptions, also through the introduction of advanced and innovative electric energy service, such as in the public mobility and residential markets. The results highlight Enel net zero commitment to a more and more sustainable and integrated business, fully aligned to the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition, Enel, as a signatory to the business ambition of 1.5 degrees, a campaign promoted by the United Nations, is already certified by the Science Based Targets initiative, and to reverse the climate change altered global warming with a reduction in greenhouse gases emission of 80% from the 2017 through the total coal phase out in 2025 towards the full decarbonization in 2050. So the next slide, from February of this year, Enel is official member of the corporate engagement program within the Science Based Target Network, and we started working for testing and developing the process and method according to what recommended by Science-Based Target for Nature methodology towards target setting on nature conservation. We will be presenting mainly the preliminary results related to the very first step of step 1, the materiality assessment at sectorial level. And the focus of this presentation will be mainly on some relevant technologies. And the sector materiality analysis is fully aligned to the global industry classification standard and anchor tool. So we follow the science-based target for nature recommendations since the beginning, trying mainly to align what we have already developed internally in terms of materiality analysis to the science-based target for nature process and standard method. We will be showing you a particular focus on the scoring in direct operations because upstream and downstream phases are still internally under assessment and analysis. According to the scoring criteria, we will consider all high and very high values as material, but in addition, we are taking in consideration also some medium scores, some medium values, because relevant for the technology. So now I will leave the floor to my colleague, Ileana Lepanto, who will be showing you the details of the development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luisa. Hello, everyone. This is Ileana Lepanto from Enel Group. I'm an environmental engineer and I'm working in the Environmental Competence Center of Enel Global Power Generation. So as my colleague Luisa said, I'd like to present you briefly some partial outcomes that came out of the materiality assessment done on Enel Global Power Generation perimeter. We started our work by first putting our company within the appropriate sector proposed by the GISCS. As you can see, we are into the utility sector, but going in deep into the sub-industry classification, we have to consider both the electric utilities sector and the renewable electricity. This is due to the complexity of our business and in particular to the different features of our technologies or processes to keep on using the GISCS wording. Indeed, the Enel Global Power Generation fleet is composed by traditional electric plants, and this is the case of CCGT and gas plants, but also by renewable belonging to hydro, solar, wind, and geothermal. I'd like to underline that due to this complexity, what we have done in this step of the materiality assessment and analysis goes a little beyond what was requested by SBTN. In fact, we are not limited to sectorial analysis, which is not very, representative for our business, but we moved a little further into detail by proceeding with an analysis by process. And today we'll present you the main outcomes from hydro, solar, and wind processes. So please go to the next slide. Okay. So before starting to analyze the hydro results, I'd like to present you the structure of the slides that is the same for all the technologies we are going to show you. So let's start from the table. Here we have represented both for Anchor and Enel the proposed values of the impacts generated on different environmental aspects and clusters. The idea is to represent the triplets for upstream, direct operation, and downstream phases with the aim to analyze the impacts produced in all the value chain. But as Luisa said before, at the moment we have completed just the analysis on the direct operation, while we are still completing the evaluation on upstream and downstream phases. Therefore, by comparing the direct operation impact values according to what proposed by the Anchor tool and according to what proposed by Enel, we have circled in red the common evaluation of materiality. On the contrary, we have circled in green the cases of discrepancy between the two assessments, and which is the case where for Enel the impact is not to be considered as material. And finally, we have a third case. We have circled in orange the case for which even if from a first internal analysis for us the impact is not material, due to our specific knowledge and sensitivity on the business, we think it's better to go in deep in the analysis and consider as if it was material. For example, in this case, for hydroelectric process, we are considering materials the impact produced on both terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. So now we are focusing on the red circles. These impacts are mainly related to the change of habitat from riverine to lacustrine produced when the hydroelectric reservoir is constructed. And this is a modification that is produced during the construction phase of the plants, but that impacts on all the plant life. And the most involved environmental aspects are the biodiversity, both flora and fauna, the land use, and the habitat loss. Passing to water resources, from our analysis, the impact produced by hydro plants is low, and this is due to the very few requirement of water that this technology need. There is basically 0 liters per kilowatt hour. So in our opinion, it is not to be considered material. Passing to climate change, even if from our analysis this impact is low, mainly depending on the positive impact that in general the hydro technology produces in terms of greenhouse gases avoided emission in the national energy mix of each country. We think it's better to deepen the analysis on the greenhouse gas emissions produced by an hydro reservoir, especially in particular climatic conditions and biomass present. So to conclude the view on hydro, our evaluation on both water and soil pollutants did not produce a materiality, but on contrary, we estimated a low impact mainly related to accidental and localized oil spills or other releases of hazardous materials that could potentially occur during the normal operation phase of an hydro plant, but that represents a low risk. So next slide, please. Okay, the same approach is applicable also to the other processes analyzed, and here it is represented the evaluation done for solar plants. For this technology, we'd like to highlight the impact on terrestrial ecosystem. Our evaluation shows a medium value, mainly due to the impact on visual landscape, while Anchor suggests a very high value. But also in this case, as done for greenhouse gas emissions in hydro, applying the same sensitivity approach, we think it's better to go in deep in analyzing this impact, in particular focusing on the land use. It is important, in fact, to understand which type of land use our solar plants are occupying. The other aspect we'd like to highlight for solar is the water resources. From our analysis, the impact produced by solar plants on water exploitation is low, and this depends on the very few requirement of water that solar photovoltaic plant need, basically 0 also in this case. As for hydro, we think is not material. Next slide, please. Okay, the last process or technology we like to show you is the wind. Also for this technology, we'd like to highlight the impact on terrestrial ecosystem. In this case, our evaluation is totally aligned to the anchor one and shows the high potential on this environmental aspect. In addition to impacts on visual landscape and land use, for sure, the main potential effects are those on biodiversity, fauna in this case, and especially on birds and bats that could respectively impact on the blades or suffer barotrauma. Passing to marine ecosystem, what we'd like to show is a misalignment in the evaluation between the one proposed by Anchor and the NL1. In particular, the impact on marine ecosystem should not be applied to our specific business because the Enel wind fleet, including just onshore wind turbine generators, while the sectorial study included also offshore plants. Last evidence for wind is that on disturbances aspect. In this case, even though the evaluation shows a medium value both from Anchor and Enel sides, our specific knowledge suggests us to deepen the potential impacts produced by some physical agents during the operation and maintenance phase, such as the noise caused by wind turbine generators. In this case, the main potential impact due to noise pollution produced by moving blades is obviously to humans more than to other species. So to conclude our speech, next slide, please. We sum up the main outcomes and takes out emerged so far. So in our opinion, the GICS sectoral classification takes together very different technologies, such as photovoltaic and thermodynamic for solar or offshore and onshore for wind. As Enel, we have done the materiality sectorial analysis for each technology on direct operations, and this is aligned to SBTN method, but we'd like some more operative indications for upstream and downstream phases. So all the suggestions are welcome in this point of view. In fact, for upstream and downstream impacts, we started to analyze which could be the best way to do the analysis. And we think they could be evaluated using, for example, standard life cycle impact assessments, but probably in this way, the results could not be immediately comparable to SBTN ones. So for this reason, we are proposing to discuss how the SBTN method could be aligned with the most common use for LCA. So that's all, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ileana. We have a few questions and some time. We got one from Eleni asking, how did you calculate the Enel numbers? Eleni, do you want to take yourself off of mute and expand on that question? I don't quite understand it.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. It was when you had the slides with the kind of materiality scores and then you had an Enel specific score. Yes, these ones. So for example, here, water resources from Encore is 5, but then it looks like it's 2.5. And I wondered how that was determined for Enel.
Okay. In this case, our evaluation on the direct operation impacts was done using some internal instruments. For example, we use for each technology an internal instrument that we called environmental risk assessment, and it's a sort of matrix that has more or less the same logic used in this case for this kind of analysis. So for sure, we did a big effort in realign the environmental aspects and the different phases during the value chain, or in this case, just for the direct operation, but we have some different phases such as design, construction, and operation. But for sure, this kind of internal tool helped us very, very much to do this analysis.
Great, thank you.
And Alon has asked you on your low impact on water resources, are you considering average flows or shorter term as well?
Okay, this is a little complex to explain because this is very related to the our internal evaluation for the internal instrument, because in our environmental risk assessment for the water, we consider a unique aspect to that unify the water use, the water pollution, and the eutrophication, for example, are sub-impacts. For this reason, when we, in this work, we have to separate this contribution in the freshwater ecosystem. For example, we considering only the eutrophication process, excepting for hydro, in which obviously we have considering also the impacts on aquatic biodiversity. So, for example, the impact on freshwater is missed in our criteria, but for water resources, for example, we use an estimation on an average water requirements that include freshwater use.
Thanks so much. Joshua had asked you a question in chat, so if you wouldn't mind answering that after we move on. And there may be some more questions for you. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for the presentation. Very enlightening. I really appreciate it. We're moving on to BL Evolution now. So let's ask Fanny Bancourt to come online.
Thank you, Jess. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great.
And we see you.
Great. So yeah, BL Evolution is a sustainability consulting firm dedicated to CSR, climate and biodiversity strategies for 10 years. And we have been working with SBT4Nature with big groups in France since the beginning of the year. And so we take this opportunity to present first results and feedback from 3 of them. And so thank you to those 3 companies. 2 of them wish to remain anonymous for the time, but it will maybe help you to see where they are at. And the first one that is not anonymous is La Poste. It's a postal company in France. And I will show you what we've done with them. So the first thing we did was identifying what we would call activities and sub-activities to evaluate impacts on. So we chose both activities and also assets to consider upstream. So activities are what the company does, so sorting and managing objects and transportation. And assets are resourcing, allowing to carry out the activities, so building, electricity, others. And the first thing we did was trying to evaluate the importance of the volume of these activities or assets for the entire company. And we used data from the share of the company's turnover, the purchase cost for the company for this specific asset, the purchase volume for the company, and that kind of stuff to give a score on a scale for 1 to 5 for each one of the sub-activities. The second thing we did is close to what Enel did, is trying to adjust the impact level for each one of the activities on each one of the different drivers for impact on nature. So we, this SBTN provide the matrix, and what we did is we took the numbers corresponding the closest to the activity in question. It could be from direct operation of the sector, but it could be on upstream or downstream of the sector according to the company. And we adjusted it a little bit. First thing, because we had some missing data. As you've seen, the matrix is not all complete. So we use expert opinion and previous analysis and knowledge of the impacts to have a new number when data was missing. and we figured some inconsistencies between SBT and subsectors, and the activities being maybe that activities were smaller or not as broad as the sub-industries were in the database. So we had to adjust a bit in those mean the impacts in order to not forget some impacts. For example, in the air freight and logistics, the impacts for the non-greenhouse gases pollution is not so high, and we decided to put it a bit higher in order to not forget it and to keep it in our analysis, because we think it's quite it's a quite big impact. And once we have this two different data graded on 5, we identified the most material activities, meaning the one that were the most material in terms of impact, but also the most material in terms of importance in volume for the company. And we selected the most material for doing the quantification and the specialization of the impacts. So we get something like that, which is a table with all the activities with an impact higher than 3 in this particular category. So all these activities that you can see here, it means that, for example, on the first line, there is an activity regarding transport that has huge impacts on freshwater and marine ecosystems, but also water resources, other resources, GHGs, GHG emissions, etc. And the importance of the activity, you can see we ranked them from 1 to 5 in order also to focus in priority on the biggest activities in volume and their impacts. And so the results and feedbacks from that is that, as you can see in the table that I just showed you, that we have about 50 different data that will need to be collected. Like all the spots here are where data is needed to be collected, because it means there is an impact higher than 3, so an impact at a level of 4 or 5, and on different activities. So we need to gather data on all of that. And for each impact drivers, we have several activities that have high potential impact, and they can be from most important activities, such as transport and internet and electrical activities. But also there are some impacts that you can see in green here from real estate and furniture that are not core business, but can have a real high impact on nature. And we decided to take them into account also. And you can see that the greenhouse gases is one of the biggest impact for all the activities. And it's great that the company already did its SBTi target for climate, because then we don't have to do that right now, because it would be the biggest data collection to do. And now we can focus on other things, especially on resource use, that, as you can see, has quite a high impact for a lot of different activities. And yeah, a lot of activities rely on different natural resources, and we will need to quantify all of that. So the key feedbacks for this case is that the first screening really enabled the team to see the broader picture, because they were used to see only the carbon footprint, and so to focus on activities with high carbon footprint, in their case on transport. And here they see that their buildings, but also the textile they may use for their employees, and also restoration that they use for their big group, are also key elements that they should take into account in their environmental footprint. Also, we have a feedback on the other resources that would need to be a bit more precise in order to be able to assess it better, because right now we put a lot of things in it, and it would be helpful to have a clear understanding of what is meant by that. And also some impacts were maybe underestimated in the sectoral materiality matrix, maybe because the sub-industries are quite broad, but maybe for other reasons we haven't identified, and we had to adjust a bit of data. So yeah, one of the feedback is be sure that you don't underestimate some impacts just because it's not an impact for the sub-industry, but it could be an impact for your activity. So I guess it's the step 1C to be really careful to refine the data and not focus only on what should be really important for the sector, but consider specificities of your activity. So to get a bit of an overview, and on the next step, we completed the sector level materiality assessment and a bit of the value chain assessment, and we're in process for data collection right now to collect the 50 different data for all the material issues. And we will also just after collect geographic data to connect impact to location, and this may be quite a challenge because we are not an industrial company, but the impacts come from many different activities with many different suppliers. So now another results and feedback from another group that is in real estate. So we started with a recent biodiversity impact assessment that used the main impact drivers and the main activities of the value chain. And as you can see, the more vibrant the color, the higher the impact intensity. And so the company decided to quantify its impact on all the more important topics and parts of the value chain. And as for the La Poste group, here the SBTi targets means that they don't have to work on GHG. And so they are currently working on quantification. So how are they doing that? For example, on land artificialization. So what you can see here on construction and material extraction, land and sea use. They are using homemade ratios based on standard projects. They cannot have data for all the projects. They have more than 80 projects. So what they do is take a standard project and do ratios from that. And this gives them a first estimate on land artificialization. On water consumption, on the other hand, they have a precise reporting that they can use. And a really interesting thing they did on raw material consumption, one of their big impact and also degradation of habitats from this consumption is doing ratios of kilogram of each material type used per square meter and per type of projects from a study. And they multiplied those areas of project per type. So they used sectorial data and they translated that for their own size of projects. And something that they could not do is work on pollutions because there were no available ratios at the moment and no detailed data found at the moment. And same thing for invasive alien species. So it will be something they will try to work in the next steps. But it's not as easy as the other because it's quite hard to get on some data. So to overview, it is about the same progress here with already starting the geographic data collection because their sites are really well known all around the world and a lot of impacts happen on sites. It's quite easy to do this location, and that it will be more complex for raw materials for construction because they can come from a lot of different places around the location of each site. So this will be in the next phase also of collection. And finally, I wanted to present you last company from construction sector that decided to work in 2 steps. First step was doing a bit like Enel again, so taking all the sub-industry they are in and seeing if they were okay with the numbers and refining them a bit and justifying what they would, where they would refine. For example, here you can see that they have adjusted some impacts and that they have explained why they have adjusted each of the impacts. But one conclusion of doing this work, it's really hard to compare the whole thing, and it would be really hard to collect all the data for all the places where there is a 4 or 5. So they decided to use the Global Biodiversity Score. You can check it out if you don't know, but it's the tool they decided to use. It's developed by CDC Biodiversité. And it's able to do an impact assessment in mean species abundances by square kilometers and by entrance and activities. And so you have a way to compare all issues in the same metric and to identify which should be the priorities. And you can use estimate data at the beginning, and then on biggest impact, just as you would do with a carbon footprint, you take more precise input data, and so you have more detailed impact. So that's what they are in the process of doing. And they will then compare their data with this matrix to be sure that they don't forget any important and material impact. And they will also add some data collection on drivers that are not included in the GBS, such as invasive species. They will try to find data on that. And of course, geographical location. Some of it can be helped with the GPS that have world-based data on where should some stuff come from when you buy it in certain country. But refinement will be needed on the geographical part. And so the overview is a bit the same as the other one. Step 1A and 1B are in progress, and the GBS will help with the data collection and the geographical connection. And really shortly, our first result and feedback, as with all we've done with lots of different companies. The first thing is that the sectorial assessment is really a great tool for a first approach, because it's really easier to have number and adjust them than to create numbers and to try to identify materiality from nothing. So even if it's not perfect, it's great to have it and to start from that. It's great to get another view than the typical one from the company, environmental equals greenhouse gases. It's good to have the vision of different drivers. And 2 things that we find are really the key of the exercise is one, perimeter setting. If the company have a lot of activities, it's quite difficult to identify all the sub-industries, but it's quite key to do that right, to have the right impacts. And also to define what is upstream. Is it only upstream and the materials that you need for your product? But in the case of service sectors, upstream can be also employees and employees restoration, equipment production, and a lot of different things. So it was quite hard to identify all the elements that are upstream and can have a huge impact on biodiversity, such as textile or restoration. And finally, data collection is quite an intricate step, and the main challenge on that will not be the data collection, but more on the interpretation of a huge number of data and a huge number of geographic locations. So yeah, that were our feedback. Thank you so much for the companies that are doing this with us. It's really interesting. And thanks for having us share all of that here.
Thank you so much, Fanny. That was really interesting, and it's cool to see the different approaches amongst the sectors. Very interesting. Are there any questions for Fanny? Any questions? Okay.
There
If
was
not,
one question. Could you elaborate a little more on the challenge to data interpretation?
Yeah. So as you've seen on some of these examples, we will have data from a lot of different, coming from a lot of different things. So we will have cube meters of waters. We will have partial like square meter of land degradation and lot of things. And then to know what is high and what should be taken into account and what is within the Earth limits, we think this is the key point of the SBT4Nature definition, and there will be the challenge. It's not having this number of how much companies consuming or how much water they are using, but much more, are they using enough? And yeah.
A question from Dominique was, could you elaborate? Oh yeah, how to manage it.
Yeah, I don't have the answer yet on how to manage it.
Okay. And Joshua, can you take yourself off mute and just ask the question?
Sure. Hi. I was just wondering, especially because you're like a consulting firm, so maybe you've experienced this with a few companies. If a company has a science-based target that is for their operations and it's aligned to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and there is a target for scope 3, but maybe there's less clarity around if the scope 3 target is aligned with 1.5. I'm not sure if the Science-Based Targets Initiative methodology has that alignment or not. I really don't know, but I'm just curious if you've encountered that in your work, if some companies have had 1.5 aligned targets for their own operations, but not for scope 3, and then if that leads to a different consideration of climate in this sort of value chain mapping.
Yeah, most of the companies that have done the SBTI targets did it on the 3 scopes. So we decided to exclude it at this point because they're already done the work on collection, etc. But surely we don't know what will be authorized for SBT4Nature.
Thanks, Fanny. That was a great presentation. Let's move on to our last folks, and we will have Brian and Juliet presenting the Bell case study.
Yes, thanks a lot, Jess and Sarah, and all the SBTN folks. Nice to meet you all. So I'm Juliette Pugliesi, WWF France representative for SBTN, and working also on natural capital and biodiversity issue. So why this presentation? Actually, WWF has the particularity as an NGO to work with companies to improve their sustainable practices by doing some corporate partnership. So we have a partnership with Bell Group since 2012, working on supply chain mostly. So Bell Group is a French dairy company implemented in more than 130 countries and working with more than 2,500 breeders partners. Unfortunately, our main contact at Bell is ill today, so she's excused not to being here with us. Just a quick introduction. Since 2020, in 20, we are working on biodiversity issue with Bell and supporting them by defining their biodiversity strategy that is actually publicly available on their website if you wanted to check. And since the end of 2020, Bell has been an early mover and joined the corporate engagement program. We are currently working on step 1 and 2 at the group level, and also on step 3 at the landscape level in a dairy basin to define science-based target for biodiversity. With the support of Metabolic and other actors. So today we will focus on step 1, and I will let the floor to Brian to explain our approaches.
All right, thanks, Juliette. I guess I have the advantage of presenting an organization which is in some way less complex than some of the others that have come through, and also not having to represent the company myself. I can go straight to the technicalities. I saw a lot of questions coming up in the chat about data sets and tools and stuff. So also happy to talk a little bit in a bit more detail about that sort of stuff. I think we should also say that, this is an ongoing piece of work. So what we're presenting is more process than outcomes. I have a few slides on what outcomes could look like in graphical form, but this is not Bell outcomes. This is just fake outcomes that we've made to help people understand what they could look like. This is how we've structured the first two steps. It's nothing new. It's what everybody's familiar with, but it's the different processes and some of the iterations and some of the outcomes. I guess the most important thing is this part is pretty straightforward. Everybody's presented on it already, so we don't need to go into too much detail there. We use company data to do the value chain assessment, and it's a mix between primary data and proxy data, depending on what it looks like and where it's patchy. And the outcome of that is quantitative impact estimates across the issue areas that come out here. Then obviously we do the company refinement, and what you come out with is the final list of material issue areas for the organization to take into step 2. So we're going to stop about here in this presentation. It's going to be a little bit short. Maybe we can come back when we're further along. This is what it looks like for Bell Group agricultural products. Basically, the most material issues are all upstream. High materiality, GHGs and land use change, and then less material, but still important, are the ones on the right-hand side that you see. So the process that we go into, interesting to see some of the other presentations from Fanny and also Joanna about how you guys go into sort of assessing these to sort of validate the outcomes of that. We're not taking that approach. We would do the assessment for the value chain for all of these issue areas, and then probably come back at the end and maybe look at the comparison for Encore. But we really look at Encore as this gives you a long list, a slightly shorter list then to work with, and coming out again with something shorter. So what we do is, and also what Fanny was saying about the challenges of data is something that we're all very familiar with. You have large distributed global organizations who have lots of different ways of managing their data, and we need to take all of that data, ask the right questions first, which is one of the hardest parts, receive the data, identify gaps, structure the data, and then iterate on that, and until you build a picture where you feel like, okay, we have sufficient saturation of the organization or understanding of it, and that we can fill the gaps that are there. Something like an 80-20 rule is generally acceptable. This on the left-hand side is just an example of some of the different data sets that came through to us from Bell. So outcomes of their carbon and the climate work, but then also some farm level assessments that they've done, data sets of their various material sourcing and some of their packaging work. We would primarily take a materials perspective. So what we really want to know, or how we really want to, actually, I think I have a slide, I'm going to skip to this slide. What we really want to know is, what are you sourcing? Where are you sourcing it from? Where is it flowing to? What's happening there? And then where are the products going to market? And then with that much information, you can more or less capture everything. So you see that on the right-hand side, differentiating between countries. It might be landscapes, it might be countries, it might be regions, and then different materials. And then with this sort of structure, we can more or less come to understanding then, like, if the outcomes are, what are the important materials or activities of the organization? What are the important issue areas for those materials or activities, and where are they? That's more or less what we can come to if we can structure the data this way. There's invariably lots of gaps to deal with. And there's lots of ways to deal with those gaps, which I'm happy to talk about. So we take this information, we then look at, okay, this is just an example. What are we trying to understand, and how far can this data help us? So you see here that we differentiate between value chain coverage. Do we know is it upstream, downstream, or direct operations? And do we know if it has regional coverage? Do we know where these activities are happening, where the material is coming from? And then we work across the issue areas, and is this helping us with some of the assessments? If yes, great. If no, then we need to use some proxies. And maybe an example is around water use, where we might not know the use of water embedded in any given materials that the organization is sourcing, but we can get to that through using various data sets, such as from the FAO or from scientific publications. So I already talked about this part, but that's just about how we structure it. And then some of the different sort of approaches or tools that we can use or that we would use, again, working across the issue areas and across the value chain tiers. If I start on the top left, depending on what we're talking about, depending on where it is, there's different types of land or sea use change issues to consider, and then different types of data sets are useful. Is it an area where deforestation is very important? Then something like the Global Forest Watch can be helpful. So this is the contextualization that Fanny was talking about. The biodiversity impact metric is a way of calculating the biodiversity impact of a given agricultural product or biomaterial, where it's produced, how it's produced. Will give you a score, and you can compare between different countries. You can compare against national baselines, regional baselines, etc. It gives you an understanding of how important this material is within the organization or against the sector or whatever. Trends.Earth is an approach for understanding land degradation that can give you an understanding of how land degradation may or may not be an issue for the area that you're sourcing these materials from, and then you can model how much we can attribute potential land degradation to the production of these materials, and so on through them. And water use contextualization using aqueducts from the World Resource Institute or the water risk filter to really understand, okay, there's this amount of water that's being embedded in the materials that the Bell Group are using, but what's very important to also understand is where what the local context of for water access, water scarcity, water pollutants, etc. is for where that's happening. So putting these two things together is basically what we do to try to come to the outcomes to help us understand what is eventually important for the organization. Moving further along, then we would, at this stage of the assessment, so this is again materiality sort of zoomed out, really looking to help us with the prioritization, LCA approaches. There's plenty of different data sets out there that can help you with these sorts of impacts from GHG and non-GHG emissions and different types of pollutants, as well as Exiopace, depending on what your granularity is of your data. And then thinking about downstream or invasive species, I think you really, or we would be looking at rather a bespoke approach to understanding what the potential downstream or end of life issues that we would need to consider. And it's very, very sector specific and geography specific. So I won't go into much more detail there. So once you go through all of that analysis and you've got your impact metrics across all of these different impact areas, then it's really about just structuring the information in a way which helps us to make decisions. So what I have now, and I'm coming to the end already, is a couple of graphs just to sort of illustrate what that can look like. This is looking at upstream water footprint, and we just structured according to the bins or the categories of the aqueduct tool from low, missing is not one of them, from low to extremely high water risk or stress, depending on what you're interested in, the country where the materials will be sourcing from, and the materials that you're sourcing, and then a breakdown of the extremely high. And this, you know, if we're thinking, okay, well, where should we be focusing on water? What geography, what materials upstream for the organization? This can help us to pull out the hotspots that are relevant. These obviously are there are underlying data sets which you would then interrogate in more detail, but these sorts of communication pieces we find helpful to take to the company into discussions to come to the conclusions that we need to. Another example, and please remember these are not specific to Bell Group, these are just examples, is where you can then look at the different impact areas across the x-axis, total sourcing, land footprint, the biodiversity impact that we discussed already, the blue water use, potential land degradation, marine eutrophication, and CO2 emissions. And you can imagine on the left-hand side, these are categories for a company. This could just as easily be products. This could just as easily be sourcing regions. It can just as easily be the aggregation of their processing plants. So that depending on what the useful unit of operation is for the organization to tunnel down into eventually to set targets. But this is useful in then really understanding, okay, for dairy, land degradation is jumping out at me, and maybe we then want to look in more detail about where that's happening. For grains, biodiversity impact seems to be quite high. So let's tunnel into that a little bit further and try and understand that. And these can be, again, pivoted in whatever way is useful to help us understand the data to get to that point where we go through company refinement. So that's more or less what I have to share with you guys today, short and hopefully useful for everybody to see. So I think I can just stop now because this is information that everybody knows already.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Juliet. Do we have any questions for Brian? For Juliet? About Bell or anything else? I'm not hearing anything. Sarah, you can turn off the PowerPoint so we can see everything. We have like 2 minutes for general questions to anybody, and then I'm gonna ask Alain Vidal, our new technical director, to make a few observations. Does anyone have any questions for anyone else who presented today that haven't been answered yet?
Hi, can I jump in with a quick question?
Yeah.
It's maybe one that anybody can try and pitch in with an answer. I did some similar sort of value chain mapping last year. I was involved in a project for a company, and one of the big conflicts that we had was emerging research and sort of emerging technologies, which were constantly kind of trying to outdo each other. And I just wondered if anybody could say a little bit about how you resolve sometimes those sort of, you know, innovative solutions that are just on the only just emerging onto the market, but could really change things. And maybe a company wants to try and pitch their impact as being significantly better as a result of that.
Anyone care to respond?
Sorry, are you talking about blockchain and that sort of things that map the pathway between some products? Is that what you mean by technology?
I'll give an example. So for example, wind turbine technology that's evolving to have lower vibration impact in marine environments, or be more recyclable. For example, where you know, you're looking at composite wind turbine blades that need to be managed at the end of life, and as a result, that can have a massive shift, for example, on your waste stream impact.
Yeah, personally, we haven't got to that detail yet in terms of potential solutions, but one thing we're very aware of is that there's no absolute solution that fits all. And there's always trade-offs. So at that point, when we get there, we aren't there yet. But we will be very mindful that there's potentially trade-offs on whichever potential actions that we might adopt. So, but we haven't got that far.
Thanks, Joanna. Thanks, Ben. I'm going to hand it over to our new technical director, Alain, to just make a couple of observations of what he's heard today.
Thanks, Jess, and good morning, good afternoon to all. Yeah, just 1 minute to say that glad to join this call. I joined late, had a clashing appointment. Good to reconnect. I used to be on the side of companies when I was in my previous incarnation as WBC SD Science Director. So good to see the progress. The only, I mean, very interesting to see what different companies have done in different sectors on these materiality assessment, the steps 1 and 2, and I found it really rich and enlightening. So thanks a lot for all your contributions. I think we have a challenge here that SBTi had on climate is the issue of scope 3, which is the indirect impact, especially on the product sourced, on what goes beyond your company. And I think what you presented, Brian, was a good example. It was raised through the questions or through your presentation. And I think that's something that we haven't completely designed, because we recognize it's a complex issue depending on which are the Earth system we're looking, whether it's land or biodiversity or water. But I think that's not a reason for forgetting it in your materiality assessment, when of course it's an important one. It's quite obvious that in some of your companies or companies specific businesses, the scope 3 impact on nature is a key element, has a strong materiality, so important to have it, even if we don't know exactly yet how to measure it. So that would be my sort of final piece of advice here, and thanking you all for your efforts and accompanying us, because what you have presented here helps us strongly, the tech team, to advance on what will be the update of our guidance this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Alon. That's wonderful. Thank you to all the speakers. It was really enlightening. Seriously, hearing from all of you, your different approaches. We're going to take this back to our technical teams. And I just saw a question from Andrea about tools. Our tools team will be presenting the next iteration of the materiality matrix to you on June 22nd. That's going to be our next meeting. And also their revised roadmap on tools. And so, so they took all your feedback from the sessions we've already had, and they have some ideas about how to move forward that they think will be helpful. So they're going to test that with you on June 22nd. And with respect to today's session, any questions that were asked in the chat that we did not answer, the speakers have kindly agreed to go back and answer them. We will send those answers out with some iteration of the slides that they presented. They're going to fix up the slides a little bit. So that'll be the next step for this presentation. If you have any other questions that you didn't get to ask, please send them to me and I'll pass them on to the team. And yeah, with that, I want to say thanks for your participation, your great questions, and thank you for helping us learn more. Appreciate it. Have a great day. Bye, everybody.